Well, good evening, everyone. I'm sorry for the late start. We had an absurd number of technical difficulties, but we're past that now. Hopefully, I can get you out of here quicker since you've had to wait for so long. Tonight, we'll discuss a few different things in detail. We'll talk about two of the most important figures, really foundational figures of the early Middle Ages, and those are the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian and Pope Gregory the Great, or Gregory the First. And we'll talk about briefly why they were significant, what they contributed to the development of the church, but then also broader society. And then, as I mentioned last week, we'll take a closer look at Islam, its founding by Muhammad, how it spread extremely rapidly, and then the actions that Muslims took over several centuries that helped set the stage for the later Crusades. I'll quickly repeat the preface that I said last week. If you don't want to learn about Islam or hear about Islam, just know I apologize for that, but it's not logical to try to do an overview of church history without talking about Islam. So there's your forewarning for that. So we'll jump right in. We'll start talking about Justinian. Justinian ruled from 527 to 565, so just under 40 years. So a fairly long reign for a monarch in this time. And his was a reign that was conducted almost entirely from Constantinople. And it was a reign that would set the stage for the Eastern Empire's flourishing, development, as it went on through the centuries to come. When historians talk about the shift from the ancient period to what they call the Byzantine period, Justinian's reign is kind of seen as the transitional piece from the old to the new in that case. But he's also very important for how we understand how the medieval West or the Western Europe sort of developed. Justinian came to the throne as a Christian, and by all accounts, is a pretty militant Christian at that. And a lot of historians view him as really the first Christian emperor that was really determined, actually determined, to bring about uniformity in the empire on the matter of Christian orthodoxy. When Justinian first came to the throne, the church in the East was grappling with heresy called Monophysitism. The Monophysite heresy claimed that Christ only had one nature, and that was a divine nature, which flew in the face of the Orthodox position, which had been established at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and that was that Christ had two natures, one being completely divine and one being completely human. But some Christians thought, in the East, thought that Christ sounded sort of schizophrenic in this. I mean, obviously they wouldn't use that term, but to them, it sort of sounded like there were two persons in one body. And they didn't like that because they wanted a fully unified Christ. And in particular, more often than not, they wanted to focus on his divinity. And so Justinian was determined to ensure that this heresy wouldn't come to dominate the empire. And he worked vigorously to try to stamp it out. He wasn't fully successful, and he ended up causing a lot of tensions, actually, and some divisions within the church. But he wanted to see the faith flourish, and he wanted to see it more intimately connected with the empire itself. And part of how he tried to bring that about was through this great building program to build these massive, great churches to honor God, and in the process to honor Justinian a little bit as well, as this sort of great and pious emperor. And he built churches all over the place, both in Constantinople and then across the Eastern Empire. But the capstone of that program was completing in 537 the Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, there in Constantinople. For centuries, it was the largest church in all of Christendom, there with its great dome on top, and some accounts, from people at ground level saying that when you look up at the dome and the great gold mosaics that are etched into it, it looked like the dome was floating above the world. To name another, he also built the Church of the Apostles there in Constantinople, which he completed in 550, and that would go on to be the tomb of all Byzantine emperors for centuries afterward. So he invests massively into this immense building program. And then one of the most remarkable of these churches, actually, that's still standing today, is in the Italian city of Ravenna. If you remember Ravenna from last week being, for a time, the capital of the Western Roman Empire. And if you can see on the screen, if assuming that's up, this mosaic of Justinian, this is the most famous image we have of him today. It's etched actually above the altar in that church, looking down on the altar, sort of portraying him again as this very great and pious Christian emperor. So here he is, this Christian emperor who's advancing the cause of Christ and also persecuting the pagans and deviant Christians alike. And Justinian really marks the beginning of this sort of great experiment that you see throughout all of the Middle Ages, all across Europe. And it's repeated over and over and over again. And that is this idea of a truly, thoroughly Christian civilization. Justinian was also a great administrator. He saw to codifying the old Roman law, which had become really a sticky mess of contradictions, and it really needed thorough revision. And so his law code that came as a result of that became the basis for almost all of Western law across Europe throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. He was also engaged frequently in war. He oversaw a series of campaigns that saw the East expand and reconquer most of the original territory that the Old West held. And in his mind, the crown jewel was recapturing Italy, the Italian peninsula. Because in his mind, the Eastern Empire was still the Roman Empire. And it was his duty to recapture Italy and liberate his brethren from pagan bondage. There's a couple problems with that, though. First, if you can remember, I was talking about it last week. A majority of the pagans that had come in and invaded Italy and more of Europe were Christian already. So there's one hole in the logic. And then second, at this point in history, no one in the East, at least, had put any sort of permanent red stamp on the idea that the West had fallen for good. And it's actually a member of Justinian's court that first advances the year 476 as the date when the West fell, which is actually just what Justinian wants to be true. Because if there's a hard and fast date on the end of the West, you can use that as a justification to invade and take back those lands under the pretense that the barbarians took the West from the empire in 476 and let them get away with it all these years, and now we got to go take it back. But there also came about a third problem for Justinian. Once the Eastern armies had taken back much of the Italian peninsula, it began to feel for those who were already living under the barbarians that they weren't so much free and liberated from bondage as they were under new ownership, under different occupation from another foreign power. And they'd had enough time and distance between the Byzantines and the East that they didn't feel like they were brethren. They didn't feel as though their brethren had come to liberate them. They felt that a foreign army had come to occupy their land. And so this helps to sort of add and pile on to the tension between the West and the East, enough to where it starts to really become palpable. So Justinian's also at a point, or he's also a point, where you can sort of see lines begin to be drawn between the West and the East. Not hard, fast lines. Wasn't a hard stop between the two. They still maintained relations and contact and trade, so much so that when Charlemagne is later crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800, he sent word to the Eastern Emperor asking if he would ratify his election, which the Eastern Emperor did do. So there's still relations between the two. But if Justinian marks the point at which there's a break between East and West, then Pope Gregory I marks the point at which the papacy in the West begins to emerge as an increasingly independent authority. The Pope began to be, in the early centuries of the Middle Ages, an increasingly independent operator, apart from the authority of the kingdoms and nations of Europe. And this starts to emerge with Gregory, who was known to history as Gregory the Great, but we'll go with Pope Gregory I. And in the early centuries of the Middle Ages, the Pope, the office of the papacy, becomes really the strongest independent figure in the West. And the papacy sort of becomes a rallying point for many in the West because it was seen as an institution of continuation of history. Some in the West felt that, the empire is disappearing, civilization seems to be ending, the old ways of Rome are fading away. And so they became desperate to find continuity, to find assurance that things are really continuing. And it was to the papacy, the Bishop of Rome, that they looked for that assurance. And remember, the office of the Bishop of Rome had been around since the earliest days of the ancient church. If anything's going to be seen as a continuation of the old ways of Rome, it's the office of the papacy, the Bishop of Rome, the leading authority in the Church of the West. So in an age of anxiety for many in the West, the Pope came to be seen as sort of a stabilizing, civilizing, and Christianizing presence there in the West. And Gregory becomes a foundational example of that because of his own talents, but then also the opportunities afforded to him in that time. He was born in 540, and he became Pope in 590, so he and Justinian sort of overlapped somewhat. He was born to a very wealthy Christian family in Rome, and he started out his public adult life as a senator, a public administrator. But eventually he came to believe that he needed to focus much more on his faith. And so he went on to give away his entire family fortune and moved to a monastery. He spent some time as the representative of the Pope at the Byzantine court, and then in 590, at the age of 50, he's elected Pope. And he very much did not want to become Pope. Gregory wanted to devote himself to prayer and the ascetic life of the monastery. But the church insisted, and he was eventually pressured into accepting the office, and then he became Pope Gregory I. He dies 14 years later in 604, so not a very long tenure, but the things that he did as Pope still resonate to this day, so much so that the Roman Catholic Church views him as one of the four great doctors of the church. The other three of those doctors are Jerome, so the great translator of the Bible into the Vulgate, Ambrose, the great preacher of Milan, and Augustine, the student of Ambrose and the great theologian of salvation. And if you go back and you read their works, you may be tempted to say that there were really only three great doctors of the church, because on a theological level, Gregory's works were not up to par. They paled in comparison to the other three. But the real reason for that title for him of Doctor of the Church is because he left such an imprint on the church through his administrative and organizational abilities, his reform of the liturgy, some of the moral direction that he laid down for the church. He wasn't a great theologian, but he was a great leader. But as great as some of what he did was, I want to quote another theologian, a much later theologian, on what he viewed was the true impact of Gregory. Philip Melanchthon, who was Martin Luther's right-hand man, and we'll learn about later, wrote about Gregory. Gregory was the torchbearer of the new theology that would come to lead the church astray. Many Protestants saw and still see Gregory as the point at which the church began to really drift from the theological footings laid down by Augustine and the other great theologians of the past. And obviously you can't say that he did it single-handedly. Even the Pope didn't have that much power then. He did come to embody a lot of what morphed into what you see to the present day in the Roman Catholic Church. Gregory was like a lot of people in his time in the church, in that he saw himself as Augustinian, despite the fact that he and many of these people didn't agree with much of what Augustine taught. They really didn't, a lot of times, know a lot about what Augustine believed. It was just kind of a thing to call yourself, to sound more pious almost. And it seems contradictory to say you're this and not really agree with it, and it is contradictory. Augustine taught unambiguously that salvation was by grace alone, but it came to be popularly believed by many, including Gregory, this sort of notion that we're saved by grace alone mostly, which may not sound like a big difference on paper, but it's an enormous difference in how it plays out. Because for these people and for Gregory, no one was saying that you could be saved without grace. And that's very Augustinian and very anti-Pelagian. Pelagius had said that we could be saved without grace, that it was helpful, but we didn't need it. And it was universal, basically, in the West, since the debate between Augustine and Pelagius, that Grace was necessary for salvation. But for these people, the question became, okay, so if you have to have grace to be saved, where does it come from? How do you get it? And how do you keep it? And that's where you see a movement away, sort of beginning from what Augustine had taught. And Gregory really becomes the great figurehead of this kind of theology that would come to be promoted in the church. Saying, well, grace, and these are Gregory's words kind of summarized. Grace is received in baptism. Of course, you have to have grace to be saved, and you get that grace in baptism. So you have to be baptized to be saved, and everyone gets grace in baptism. But then what then do you do with that grace? You have to make appropriate use of that grace, constantly hoping to lead a better life, constantly making use of confession and the sacraments, constantly confessing your sin in order to be progressing in the Christian life. Gregory, in a nutshell, wanted people to be constantly in doubt as to the state of their salvation, as to the struggle to hold on to the grace that they have. In Gregory's mind, as he actually wrote to a noblewoman once, if you knew you were saved, you would lose your motivation to keep working toward a better life, and you would neglect to repent and thus drift from Christ. So for Gregory, presuming you're saved leads you away from seeking more grace. But that grace is ultimately achieved not by God, but by cooperation between us and God. It's this sort of continually unstable and insecure grace. But this is the foundation that Gregory begins to lay for the church. A stress on grace, which is good, but of this kind of Christianity where it's a constant struggle and worry and effort in hopes, and no more than hopes, that you will die in grace and be saved. But never with an assurance in this life that that's true. And with this also, with Gregory that is, comes the beginnings of the Doctrine of Purgatory. Not in a refined, finalized form like we see it today, but the beginnings of it. This idea that if you die with sins not yet repented of and not sufficiently paid for, you must spend time in this state of suffering in order to purge those sins and eventually move on to heaven. So the argument, at least for me, can be made that about Gregory, that Gregory was sufficiently not great enough that the title of Gregory the Great is not accurate. And so at this point, I think, so I can try to get you guys out of here, we'll go ahead and take a break. We'll aim for 10 minutes at 7:18, so we'll come back around 7:28. Good? Sorry to cut break short, everyone, but we've kind of got an emergency that we need to go for. So if it's all right with you, I want to go ahead and wrap this quickly, and then we're going to leave. At this point, we'll transition from these foundational figures of the early Middle Ages to perhaps what could be called, at least for Europe and the Church, the foundational problem of much of the Middle Ages, and that is Islam. So tune out now if you don't want to know. Islam was founded by a man named Muhammad from the city of Mecca in what's now Saudi Arabia. He was born in 570, and then beginning in 610 and lasting for the last 22 years of his life, he claimed to receive revelations from God. These revelations are what we know today as the Quran, comprised of 144 chapters. Muhammad was rabidly monotheistic at a time in Arabia when most people were polytheists. In fact, if you see this picture here of the Kaaba in Mecca, which is now the holiest site in Islam, it was originally a pagan temple. He taught what he claimed to have received from God in Mecca, but was eventually quickly tossed out by the authorities. And he would, in a very short amount of time, amass a small army, march back on Mecca, and then take over the city. And after he dies in 632, the movement of the spread of Islam has already begun at this point across the Arabian Peninsula. But after he dies in 632, the leadership of both his armies and his religion fell to 4 of his trusted advisors. These men established the office of the Caliphate, which becomes the leading figure of Islam for a time, but eventually goes on to become the title of the overall religious leader of the various Muslim kingdoms. And one thing that had been particularly established under Muhammad was the significance of acquiring and holding territory. So the armies of these various caliphs began to fight their way across the Arabian Peninsula, and when they took that, they moved across the Middle East and North Africa. And then when they took all that, they moved west, I should say, with that. After that, they moved east and took much of what's now Iran and Afghanistan, into Pakistan, and even into India. And then when they took all of that, they crossed the Mediterranean into Spain and fought their way up the Iberian Peninsula, eventually making their way into southern France, getting as far as the city of Tours, so within 150 miles of Paris, before they were repulsed by Frankish armies in 732. But they would continue to nip at the edges of Europe well into the 1600s. As one example, they owned Spain, which they called Al-Andalus, from roughly 711, and wouldn't be finally kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula for good until 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So if you can see the map, these are all the lands conquered by Muslim forces by the year 750. So in a little over 100 years from the death of Muhammad, this is how far Islam spreads. Islam quickly and radically established itself as a dominant power on the world stage. But what is it about? How did this small religion come to own half the Mediterranean, even into southern Europe, in so short a time? And that leads to the question, what is Islam? And so, very briefly, to describe Islam for you, the central point that Islam revolves around is the complete and absolute, utter oneness of God. So to Muslims, the idea of God being one and yet in 3 persons, that we would say is the Trinity, is polytheism, and it's idolatrous and blasphemous. And this belief is expressed in the first of what's known as the 5 pillars of Islam. This is called the Shahada, and it says this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. This statement is so important that you can't be a Muslim at all without first affirming it. So important that for devout Muslim parents, when a child is born to them, the first words they ever hear, whispered into their ear the moment they're born, are, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And that's sort of their version of the tradition of some churches of infant baptism establishing salvation at birth. The second pillar is prayer. Prayer is extremely specific. You have to wash your hands, face, and feet before you pray. You're to pray 5 times a day, facing the direction of Mecca. There are specific positions and movements in which you pray. The mosque is the preferred place of prayer, but you can pray anywhere. And Friday is the day of congregational worship or prayer for them. So prayer is extremely important, but also extremely specific. The third pillar is charity, or almsgiving, as many of them call it. This is a mandatory tithe. The amount sort of varied over time, but right now it's fixed at 2.5% of your total worth per year. Not 2.5% of your income, as we do tithing our income. 2.5% of your total net worth, which would include all assets and then any stock holdings or anything like that. A tithe is also mandatory in Muslim-majority nations for non-Muslims. Christians, Jews, and others that aren't Muslims are subject to the jizya, which is basically paying a tax for being allowed to not be Muslim. And this has been this way for centuries. The fourth pillar is fasting, which is done during the month of Ramadan, which is actually different by 11 days every year because Islam operates off of the lunar calendar. No food or drink is to be consumed between dawn and dusk, which includes water, as well as fasting from any smoking or sexual relations. The only people allowed to skip fasting are those that are younger than puberty age, people with medical issues, and the pregnant and elderly. Ramadan ends with this enormous feast, the festival of breaking the fast. And then the fifth and final pillar is the Hajj, which is a requirement for every Muslim that's physically able to travel to Mecca during the 12th month of the lunar calendar at least once in their lifetime. Exceptions are made for, like I said, those who physically can't do it, but otherwise it's expected of the faithful Muslim, the truly faithful Muslim. Muslims believe in a succession of prophets, starting with Adam, running through names like Abraham, Moses, Jonah, all the way to Jesus, who they do acknowledge as a prophet, and then ending with Muhammad, who they say was the last prophet, the final prophet. It's important to note quickly that Muhammad is not worshipped by Muslims, and they get really mad if you accuse them of that. So don't do that. Also, Islam explicitly denies the divinity of Christ and the resurrection. To Muslims, Jesus wasn't even crucified. It only looked that way. And he was taken up into heaven. Islam is also very deterministic. Everything, good or bad, works out as God has willed. There's a significant focus on the end times. They do believe in a bodily resurrection of all people at the end to be judged by their deeds and then be sent to either paradise or hell. Regarding the Quran, Islam teaches that the Quran is the word of God. In fact, in one place, it said that the Quran itself, as a sort of almost independent entity, that though being part of God, came down to Muhammad. And it can only be truly understood in the original Arabic. Any other translation is an abomination to them. And the one thing you can see about Islam, particularly in the Middle Ages, but also somewhat in the modern period, is that from a human perspective, Islam many times succeeded in the past, as I said, mostly, in molding the cultures and the nations around Islam in ways where Christianity failed to do so. Sharia law, which Sharia is just an Arabic word for law, so law, government, family life, personal character, social motivations are built around the Quran and Islam itself. Islam is also not one whole in perfect unity. There are denominations, the two largest being the Shia and the Sunni, with other smaller denominations as well. 90% or more of all Muslims are Sunnis. The denomination of the Sunnis believes that the first four caliphs that came after Muhammad were the rightful rulers after him. And almost all of the remaining percentage are Shia, believing only Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, was the rightful ruler. And almost all Shia in the world today live in Iran, for reference. Most Muslims, or at least a lot of Muslims, do believe that both Christians and Jews are at least somewhat honorable people because they also received legitimate revelation from God. The Jews had the Torah, and Christians have the gospel, the Injil, for them. These were corrupted at a point, but they were, at least in a most basic form, revelation from God, and so they accept that to at least a degree. And so that's a very, very short explanation of some of the key points of Islam, but I'd say it's sufficient for us to go on with. And so in the centuries that come after its founding, Islam is going to affect the church and the world in numerous ways, which still reverberate to today. And we'll begin to see those over time. Next week, we'll start to look at how the church begins to establish its power in Europe in ways that it hasn't seen before, and then how that drive for power would eventually lead to a handful of good things and many terrible things along the way, which will take us into the Crusades and beyond. Have a good night.